Hi everyone. In this presentation, I will be talking about turn-taking in human-robot interaction. So turn-taking, what is that? Well, I guess most of you have experience of bad turn-taking with conversational systems. I have at least. So one example is if you want to ask your smart speaker to play some music, you might say, could you play Waterloo by ABBA? And the system might respond, sure, here it is. And the way this works is that the system uses a silence threshold to sort of decide that your turn has ended. So it might be about 1 second of silence or so. And in this specific case, it actually works because I do make a pause here, but the pause is quite short. So that's okay. But what if the pause is longer? So in this case, the system would actually detect an end of turn and it would respond to me with something that doesn't really make sense here. So I'm interrupted by the system. And of course, you can play around with this threshold to make it shorter. But then you get faster responses, but you also get more interruptions. Or you can make it longer, but then you get few interruptions, but you also get more sluggish responses. So it's very hard to find some kind of optimal threshold there. And another problem that typically happens is if you ask the system to do something, for example, and the system needs to access some resource, so it takes some time. And if that happens, it might be that the user doesn't really know whether the system has understood the question and might repeat, and then the system might try to respond at the same time, and you get this clash, and you get confusion. So these are different examples of problems that happen. And the question is then, how do humans do this? Because we know that humans are very good at turn taking. And one way of looking at this is to collect data of humans talking to each other, which has been done a lot in linguistic research. And you measure the offset between turns. And sometimes it's positive, most often, and it can be of different lengths. So this is a histogram showing how often you find different offsets. Sometimes it's negative, which means that there is an overlap. But what you find typically is that the most common time between turns is around 200 milliseconds. So that's really, really fast response time. Also considering that the second speaker has to figure out what to say also, which would take some time. So probably speakers even try to predict what the other person is saying or will be saying in order to produce a response. But one of the core mechanisms here is that we think that people use so-called turn-taking or turn-holding cues in order to signal that you are yielding the turn or holding the turn. So when you hand over the turn, you produce a turn yielding cue, and when you want to hold the turn, you have a turn holding cues. This allows us to have very rapid turn shifts at times, while also having longer pauses at other times. And researchers in linguistics have studied this a lot and looked at different cues. For example, syntax, so the grammar might be complete if you're yielding the turn, it might be incomplete if you're holding the turn. The prosody, the way we are speaking, might also change. So you might have a flat pitch if you're holding the turn, or a more rising or falling pitch if you're yielding the turn. Breathing, if you hold the turn, you might breathe in, otherwise you might breathe out. Gaze is important. So if we want to hold the turn because we are thinking, we might look away and then look back at the other speaker when we yield the turn. And what researchers have also found is that the more cues you present together, the stronger the signal is for the other speaker. So how can we put this into a system to create better turn taking in human-machine interaction? So we have studied this quite a lot. And the setting we typically use is this card game you see here to the left. So it's Furhat and it's two people talking together, discussing on how to sort these cards on the table together. And this is an excellent test bed for studying turn taking and studying how you can make turn taking better. And we have tested this in different places. For example, the Technical Museum in Stockholm, where we had around 400 interactions of people of different ages interacting with Furhat while playing this game, and where we got a lot of data that we could use to study this phenomenon better. One thing we did was to look at the data. Can we train a machine learning model to better find places where to take the turn and not to take the turn? And then we annotate the data and point out places where we think this is the case. So for example, if someone says, yeah, that's typically a turn holding cue. So you might say that this is a place where Furhat shouldn't take the turn. If someone says like this and looks at the table, it's an opportunity to Furhat to take the turn, but Furhat doesn't have to take the turn. If someone says, what do you think, and looks up at Furhat, it's clearly what we could say an obligation for Furhat to take the turn. So that's a clear turn yielding cue. But there is sort of a gray zone here, of course. And then what we did was to try to see, given the data that we have, can we take the different modalities that we get here, like the head pose of the users, which is sort of a proxy for their gaze, the prosody of their voice, the words they are saying, the movement of the cards, and what the robot has said previously, and try to build a classifier to see if we can make this decision. And it turns out that, yes, you can. And if you just use one modality, you get about 70%. If you combine them, you get even better. And if you use all of the modalities, you get around 85% correct classification. So this is really great. And you might ask, is this now in the Furhat platform? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And the reason for that is that this model is, of course, highly specific for this interaction that we see here, the card game. But on the other hand, you can actually now program your own turn-taking policy in the Furhat SDK. And just to show you an example of what happens when turn-taking doesn't work, I will play it here.
Hi there.
Hi there.
How about some fruits?
That sounds good. What do you have?
We have banana, orange, apple, and cherimoya.
Oh, tough choice. Maybe an apple.
One apple. What a lovely choice. Anything else?
Yeah, a banana.
So here you can see how the system actually interrupted me in the middle of what I was saying. And actually there was a cue there. There was a turn holding cue that I produced, which was that I was looking away. So I don't know if you saw that, but I was looking away a bit there. That could have been used by the system. So now we have something called a turn-taking policy in Furhat, where you can implement something to detect this. So the idea is that if the user says something and makes a pause and produce a turn-holding cue, like looking away here, we can give the user more time. Whereas if the user is producing a turn-yielding cue, like looking at the robot, we can sort of say that we should take the turn more immediately in order to get a rapid response. And this is just to show very quickly that it's not a lot of code that is needed for this. So we implement turn-taking policy where we say that if the current user is not attending Furhat, we give them 3,000 milliseconds. Otherwise, we give 0 milliseconds. Of course, this could be much more complicated. You can look at the response and see is there an intent identified, etc., etc. But this is very, very simple example. So let's see what that looks like.
Hi there.
How about some fruits?
Sounds great. What do you have?
We have banana, orange, apple, and cherimoya.
Oh, that's a tough choice. Maybe an apple and a banana.
One apple and one banana. What a lovely choice. Anything else?
No, thank you. That's fine.
So you can see how now when I was pausing here, it actually allowed me a bit more time. And what's great here is that once it detects the end of my turn, these different parts of my turn actually are automatically added together before we do the intent classification of the user's input. Another problem that I mentioned in the beginning is that of generating turn-taking cues on behalf of the robot. And that's something we studied in the case of the card game. So For example, if a user says, "What do you think about the tiger?" and the robot needs some time to respond and say, "I think the tiger is faster," there is an obvious risk here that the user doesn't think that the robot is actually understood here, and the user might say something here. And then we get this clash and confusion and so on. So we want to avoid that. And the way of avoiding that is to produce a turn holding queue here. So even if we don't know what to say, we can produce this turn holding queue. And we experimented with different combinations of this. So we combined looking at the user or looking away from the user with a filled pause, a breathing sound from the robot. So we did a breathe in, a smile, or doing nothing at all. So if we do nothing at all and keep the gaze at the user, we would assume that is sort of the default, doing nothing basically. We would assume that that would create the biggest confusion and the biggest risk of the user saying something here. And we can measure the effects of these by looking at how likely is it that the user will actually say something here. And we want that probability to be as low as possible. So we did this systematically at the Technical Museum with thousands of these kind of turn shifts to measure this effect. And here are the results. So this is the probability of the user saying something. And as I said, we want this to be as low as possible. And if we keep the gaze at the user and do nothing, yeah, we have almost 35% risk that the user will say something more. But if you look at the dark bars in general, that's when you gaze away. So it has clearly, in general, a good effect. But also combining that, of course, for example, with a filled pause, so saying while looking away, has a very strong effect. But the same goes with a smile. So just looking away and smiling also has this kind of turn holding effect. So that's really great. And it also shows that you can do this with different types of cues, which is great in order to create variation, because you don't want to create this filled pause all the time, of course. So one of the things that we are currently looking at is how can we make a system that predicts the future of what will happen in the dialogue in a more general way, so we don't have to create specific model for different interactions. So this is something research we are doing now at KTH, where we give the model interaction data and we ask the model to try to predict. So the red line is the current point in time, and we ask the model to predict here how likely is it, the green bar here is the probability that this person will speak in a future time window of 3 seconds. And this is what it looks like.
And down to about a centimetre below it. That's about just down from the E, down and along from the E.
That's right.
Okay.
And then do you have a tribal settlement?
And we can see here, for example, when we pause here, we can see that the model, based on these human-human interactions, think that it's more likely that this person will take the turn than that this person will take the turn. So it's actually managed to make this prediction based on what has happened so far in the interaction. That's very exciting, I think. Another thing we're looking at, can the model try to also predict what the user will say? So for example, if the system asks, how long was your trip? And the user starts to say, I'm not sure, I think it may have, then we have a very strong language model where we try to predict how this user utterance might unfold in the future. And here we don't really see a turn ending, but in this case, when we go a little bit further in time and we get, I'm not sure, it might have been about, we start to see 3 days or a week or 2 years, and here we see turn completions. So it means that the system see that, oh, actually it's quite likely that the user will be done with a turn soon, so I should start preparing my response. Now, if you think this is an interesting topic, I can recommend you to read this. So it's a review article on the topic of turn taking in conversational assistance and human-robot interaction that I published in Computer, Speech and Language in May this year. And it's giving an overview of both actually human-human interaction but also human-machine interaction. So with that, I would like to thank you very much.